Okay, today's daf is Eruvin Daf Cafe. Today's daf is sponsored in honor of Deborah Dixon's 40th birthday by Audrey Levant. Deborah, you enrich the lives of people around you by approaching life with passion. You're motivated, decisive, and committed to your endeavors. And I'm so happy we're learning Daf Yomi together. Happy birthday. Mazal Tov, glad you're with us on the Zoom. Okay, we're going to start now, Eruvin at Daf Cafe at the top, the second line. Okay, just as an intro to today, what we're basically doing is we're discussing a karpaf. I'll just review what a karpaf is. A karpaf is a large space that's enclosed, so we call it an enclosure, which means it has walls that are halachically considered walls. What's the issue though? There were walls that were put up without the intent of living in this space. It was walls put up, let's say an arena, right? A sports arena or something like that. There's actually a big question about cemeteries. Okay, cemeteries are a great example because they're not meant for living, right? Not for people who are alive, actually. They're not living spaces. And because of that, if there's a wall around it, it's bigger than a Beit Satayim. Remember, with a karpaf, what do we say? If it's larger than 5,000 square cubits, which is not a huge amount, then what do we say? It is a problem. You can't carry in there. We call it a karmelit. It's like a big sea, like a big valley, all these spaces which are not technically, halachically, Reshut Rabim, because they don't have all these people walking through. In this case, particularly, what's the problem? It has walls around it. Reshut Rabim is open. It's not something that's walled in. However, the rabbis said, this is similar enough to Reshut Rabim because what's a Reshut Yachid? It's a private domain. What is a private domain? Generally, it's used for living in. So therefore, if one is in this enclosure and one wants to carry, if it's bigger than 5,000 square cubits, a Beit Satayim, which is the amount of the space that you could plant 2 se'ah worth, it's a measurement of crops, of grains. That's why it's called a Beit Satayim. Then one is not allowed to carry within it more than 4 amot. It's basically treated like Reshut Rabim, but only on a rabbinic level, not on a Torah level. So if we have a space like this, but what did we learn? If the walls are put in, and they have to be put in for this purpose, and that's going to be part of our discussion today, if the walls were put up in order to allow someone to live in this giant open space, then it's okay. But if it wasn't put in for that purpose, then the question is, so let's say we have our space, our karpaf. It's bigger than Beit Satayim. It has a wall that was surrounded with what we call lo hukaf ledira, right? It was not put up, hukaf is to go around, like the perimeter of it, not put up for the purposes of living, but now I want to live there. Now, if I want to live there, I obviously want to be able to carry on Shabbat. So how can I change its status? So there's 2 basic options. One is I can make the area smaller, and I could somehow make it to fit in a Beit Satayim. Once it's a Beit Satayim, it doesn't matter if hukaf ledira, since it has walls and it's small, it's fine, even if it wasn't put for living purposes. Or I can put up a new wall that has to count as a halachic wall that will fix the problem. Okay, where then I end up being mekif ledira. I'm basically putting up walls for the purpose of living. So we're going to have a bunch of scenarios where they try to fix it in a particular way, and the question is going to be, does this work or not? So there's a lot of pictures for today, so have your pictures accessible. I forgot to send the link today on the Zoom group, but if somebody wants to access it and send it, try to do it now. Anyway, okay, let's get started. I'll try to do it while I'm teaching. Okay. So now we have this case. Karpaf yoter mi Beit Satayim shelo hukaf ledira. We have a karpaf that is more than the size that's allowed. Okay, so because this is more than the size that's allowed, what do we say? Uba lema'ato. He now wants to make it less. Okay, he wants to make the area smaller. So what does he do? Okay, I managed to send it. Mi'ato bi'ilanot. Let's say, if you want to make it smaller, what do? You fill up the space with other things. So we now have less open space. The open space, let's say we're going to assume these cases are just a little more than a Beit Satayim. So I'll plant trees. If I plant trees, that will make the area smaller. What do they say? Lo havi mi'ut. No, that doesn't work. Why doesn't that work? because the trees are just generally, you can have a big enclosure with trees. That's not considered something external to the space. But banabo amud, generally, you don't necessarily have a beam. If I banabo amud, and this is picture 147. If I build an amud, now you notice this amud here, it's a beam, it's some sort of pillar. It's in the middle. It doesn't even have to be on the side. You might have thought maybe on the side. Here they say, even if it's in the middle of the space, banabo amud, now it depends how big the amud is. That's going to affect whether we consider this beam to be significant enough that we can say this makes the space smaller or not. So what are the sizes? Banabo amud gavoa 10, v'rachav 4, have miut. If I build this amud that's 10 tvachim tall, now we get back to our classic definition of what is a reshut yachid. If I'm in the middle of reshut rabim and there's a big structure it's not even so big, 10 tvachim tall, 4 by 4 amot wide. 4 by 4 tvachim wide, 4 by 4 handbreadths. 4 by 4 handbreadths, 10 handbreadths tall. What do we say? Havi miut. Then this can limit the space. Now, you'd obviously have to say, this must be in a case where it's just a little bit more than a beit satayim. And by putting up this pillar in the middle or on the side or wherever it is, basically says this is not considered part of the space. Why is that? It's the same reason it's why it's not reshut rabim. In the middle of reshut rabim, this is a private domain because you can't pass through it. You can't, right? You'd have to climb over it, which would be very inconvenient. So it basically isn't considered part of the space. And then you've limited the space. Pachot mishlosha, let's say it's less than 3 by 3. Well, then obviously lo havi miut, we always talk about when we talk about din levud, which means if things are less than 3 tvachim, 3 handbreadths apart from each other, we basically view them as if they're together, right? We can put up posts that are less than 3 and view them as if they're together. So less than 3 is always the amount of something totally insignificant. So if it's less than 3 by 3, for sure, lo havi miut. However, and here we get into all these definitions that we've been talking about. 3 handbreadths, 4 handbreadths. What are they significant for? What if it's in between the laws of levud, but it's not yet the laws of this is already a reshut yachid? So mish shlosha v'ad arba'ah, Rava amar havi miut, v'Rava amar lo havi miut. There's a machlok at Rava and Rava whether this is considered significant. So let's see their reasons. Rava amar havi miut. This works. Dehanafik le mitorat levud. Now I want to be clear here. They're not using laws of levud. Laws of levud don't work here. Again, levud is if something's right next to a wall, within 3 tvachim, we're going to view it, and we're going to see this in 5 minutes, or I don't know how many minutes, a few minutes, that we basically view it as if it's attached, right? Or if you put up posts, and they're less. Here we're not using levud, but what we're saying is that since levud means that anything less than 3 is just considered nothing, right? Something less than 3 off the ground as if it's attached to the ground. That's such an insignificant number. But above that, is obviously significant, which means that for our purposes, again, it would have to be that already cuts the space down to less than to exactly a beit satayim or less. But assuming it does, that is significant enough. From 3, once it's 3 tvachim by 3 tvachim, you don't need, this is exactly what we're saying, you don't need it to be a reshut yachid to cancel out the reshut rabim. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, is it space that's going to get in people's way, right? That basically means this is not usable space in the karpaf, so we can say the karpaf is actually smaller than it looks. Okay, so according to Rabba, that works. The Rabba amar lo havi miut. Why? Kevan de lo havi makom arba'ah lo chashiv. Remember, we saw this in Mavoi. The space of a Mavoi, there was a machloket. What's the minimum size? Does it have to be 4 handbreadths or 4 cubits? According to one opinion, it was 4 handbreadths because once something's 4 handbreadths, has significance. Again, we're using these 2 different measurements. There's levud about significance and there's 4 tvachim about significance. Which is the significant number for us here? And that's the machloket Rabba and Rava. Next line. Okay, now they're going to have a machloket about something else. Same kind of idea. Hirchik min hakotel arba'a v'asa mechitza. Now we're up to the next picture. You had the mechitza. We talked about 2 ways. I said this in the beginning of class. 2 ways you can deal with this problem. We're going to see it all throughout today. Either we can make the space smaller, or we can put up a wall. So they're already walls. So let's say he moves 4 tvachim away from the wall that exists, and he builds a new wall. This is picture 148. He builds a new wall. There you have it. You built a new wall. This is what we saw with the Rechava, right? Because they put in a new wall, it counted as a wall, and then already we can say even that Lechi counted as building a wall. That allowed carrying. So here also, that's like building a new wall, and now you could say it's hukaf l'dira. So if you moved away 4 tvachim from the wall, then it ho'il. Pachot mishlosha, if you moved it away from the wall, it's going to be the same structure as before. Less than 3, then lo ho'il. Then of course it's not going to work. But because that, and now I told you we get to din levud, that's levud. That basically means that you built this new wall, but it's within 3 of the old wall. We're going to basically view that as if it's attached to the existing wall, and you're just building a mechitza on top of another mechitza, which, by the way, we've been saying all along is a problem. However, we're going to suggest in a few minutes that maybe some people think it's actually not a problem. You actually could build a wall on top of a wall. So now we're going to see. Rabba Amar Ho'il. Okay. Again, we're going to have this in between. What if you moved away from the wall more than 3, so you got out of din levud, but not yet 4? So you didn't leave a significant space between your new wall and your old wall. So again, same machloket. Rabba Amar Ho'il, Rabba Amar Eino Mo'il. So why? Rabba Amar Ho'il Danafik Le Mitoat Levud, because it's no longer levud and therefore it's fine. Rabba Amar Eino Mo'il Kevan de lo have makom arba'a lo chashiv. Since you didn't leave 4 over, it's not significant. Now we have a very strange line. Strange because nobody really knows how to read. Well, not that nobody knows, but there's different interpretations, I should say, about how to read this line. Rav Shimi, some people say Rav Simi, Amar Matne Lekula. He teaches this all Lekula, meaning now some people say this is an intro to the next section. If you look in the Koren, that's how they view this. If you look in the Schottenstein, for example, they say this is referring to what we already learned, okay? So there's different opinion. The Schottenstein usually works based on Rashi, and that's what he does here. Commentary. So based on Rashi, we say that what this means is the previous 2 cases we just learned, he teaches Lekula, meaning that Rabbah basically, who says less than 3 is a problem, actually and as everyone agrees less than 3 is a problem, Rabbah is going to say even less than 3 it works. Now, how can you possibly say that? Well, he claims that building a mechitza on top of a mechitza is okay. And this is based on what Rav Chisda is going to say in a few minutes, that there's actually a machloket about it. Until now, we've been saying mechitza gabe mechitza doesn't work, but there's actually a machloket about the topic. Some people think, and now I want you to think about it. Why would it work in this case? And we're going to see this later on when we get to Rav Chisda. What we're trying to do here is say that we're enclosing this space for the purposes of living. Now, if you think about it, one could claim this, although later we're going to see maybe they say otherwise, but maybe your original mechitzot were pretty low. Now, those work maybe to block some animals from coming in. But if you want to live somewhere, you want higher mechitzot to live in because you want privacy. And if you're going to put a mechitza on top of an existing mechitza, remember, 10 tefachim, 10 handbreadths is pretty low. So your original mechitza could have only been 10 tefachim, and now you're building it higher. You might actually be using this, and in which case, for your purposes of living. In which case the mechitzot are effective for you, which means that if I'm now putting up a wall for purposes of living, those have significance to my living space because those walls are making it a more private space. So even though it's on a pre-existing wall, it still has significance, and maybe that's why in this case, and we're going to differentiate between this case and a different case where he says, Rav Chisda says mechitza gabe mechitza works, he says it specifically in this case, but not for other halachot, okay? For when it comes to kaf l'dira, yes, but not necessarily in other cases, and that could be a potential reason as to why. So now, it's unclear what he says. In any case, most people say we don't paskin like him and others. He basically moves everybody a step lekula, okay? So that they don't really argue in 3 to 4. 3 to 4, everyone would agree works. It's less than 3 that they argue about, and obviously more than 4 would be, 4 or more would be fine. So that's one option, or that has nothing to do with the previous sugya, and actually it's an intro to the next sugya. So why would this be lekula? Because tach botit, what if instead of building a new wall, all you did, you made it's a little easier, you just plastered the wall. We know that you could put plaster on a wall, and you can actually do a thick layer of plaster. So let's say you plastered the wall, and with that, you basically limited the space of the karpaf. So if tach botit v'yachol la'amod b'fnei atzmo, if the wall, if let's say, again, this is just theoretical, you were to remove the wall and the layer of plaster that you put up would actually stand on its own, then have mi'ut. Then this works, okay? Again, only if that space, the idea was that space would make this now less than a beit satayim. So that would work, because notice the words, they've been switching between words. I want you to pay attention. Mi'ut and ho'il. Ho'il means it works as a mechitza. This counts as a mechitza. Here, we're not counting it as a mechitza. We're just saying it works to limit the space. Remember, we said there's two options. Either you can make the space smaller. So plastering this wall very thick, in a way, if it could stand on its own, then that makes the space smaller. And if now your space is only a beit sa'atayim, it's okay. But what if you were to take away that wall? Again, you're not taking away the wall, but if theoretically you were to take away the wall, the plaster would fall. It wouldn't be thick enough to stand on its own. Then again, we're going to get to a machlok at Rabba and Rava. Rabba amar have mi'ut, Rabba amar lo have mi'ut. So why? Rabba amar have mi'ut, hashta mi'akai. Rabba says, I don't care whether, imagine, if theoretically, if you took off the wall, it would stand on its own. Well, who cares? Right now, it's standing because it's attached to the wall and nobody's taking down that wall. So therefore, right now, your space is less than beit sa'atayim, so that's fine. Rava amar lo have mi'ut, kevan de lo yachol lamekam b'fnei atzmo lo klumhu. This plaster is totally insignificant because it can't stand on its own. That means it has no significance. So even though, technically speaking, your space is less than a beit sa'atayim, we don't view it as if it's less than beit sa'atayim because the plaster is insignificant. Another case. Hirchik minatel arba'a v'asa mechitza. Again, I'm going to just preface, I'm not going to give you all the different interpretations, but there are different interpretations here. But let's assume we go by Rashi, which is the way the picture shows here. In picture 150, one of your walls of your karpaf was a tail. Remember, we've learned that a hill, a mound, could be counted as a mechitza if it's 10 tfachim height, but without going 4 tfachim on the angle. Okay, so if that's one of your walls, and then he wants to build, or she wants to build a mechitza next to the tail. So if you're going to build a mechitza now, the question is again, is it mechitza al gabe mechitza? So hirchik minatel v'asa mechitza, ho'il, it works. Sorry, hirchik minatel arba'a. Again, just like before, if you distance yourself 4 handbreadths from the mound, then of course it works just like if you distance 4 handbreadths from the wall. Pachot mishlosha o al sfat hatel. Now, if you did it less than 3, within 3 of the tail, or on top of the tail, that's the picture 150, where you built it on part of the mound, okay, over the mound. If you did it like that, Rav Chisda v'Rav Hamnuna, and now we're going to get to Rav Chisda's opinion, there's a machloket between the two of them. Chad amar ho'il, sorry, it's picture 150. If I said 149, it's right. We started with 150, sorry, 149, you're right. Let me just correct. 149 is the one where you distance it 4 tvachim, and 150 is the one we're discussing now, where it's a mechitza al gabe mechitza. So now, what do we say? Chad amar ho'il, chad amar lo ho'il. One says it works, one says it doesn't. You already know from what I told you before that Rav Chisda is the one who says that it works, because he holds mechitza al gabe mechitza works. So now they're going to figure that out. Tistayim, it must be, we can conclude that Rav Chisda amar ho'il. He's the one who said this works. Why? The Itmar, it says somewhere else, Hausem mechitza al gabe mechitza, and there it says explicitly, if you put a mechitza on top of a pre-existing mechitza, which would mean that he wouldn't only say this with a tail, he would say this with a regular wall. If you put a mechitza al gabe mechitza, b'shabbat ho'il b'nichsei hager lo kana. Okay, he's going to and this is why I said before, for this purpose, it can work. For other purposes, it doesn't necessarily work. So for Shabbat, to say that this is hukaf l'dira, this is successful. It works. Because again, all you need to say is, I'm putting up some sort of wall to help me live here. And since the wall is serving you, it does work to be considered hukaf l'dira. But, which again means I'm encircling it for the purposes of living. But, nichse hager, what's nichse hager? So a ger, when a ger converts, he no longer is related to any of his relatives, okay? Even the ones who also converted at the same time, they're considered halachically not relatives, because everyone's, they're born as new people. So all their pre-existing relationships aren't halachic relationships. And therefore, if a ger dies and doesn't have children, let's say that were born after they already converted, then theoretically, there could be cases where there's a ger who dies and nobody's there to inherit. So what happens to the ger's property? It becomes what we call hefker. Hefker means anybody can come and lay claim to his property and his items. So now this gets into the laws of kinyanim. Okay, we'll get into this much later, especially in Bava Batra, about how one acquires land. One of the ways one acquires land is by doing something to the land to improve the land. If you do something to improve the land, you acquire the land through that. So he says, so what would be one way of improving the land? Putting up walls, because putting up walls protects the space. So when it comes to acquiring the land of a ger, that's hefker, you can't just put a wall on top of a pre-existing wall because you're not doing anything. The whole idea is I need to improve the land. Here I'm not improving anything. It already had a wall. So therefore, it doesn't work. So b'nichse ager lo kana. So even though he says it works for Shabbat, it doesn't work for ger. Rav Sheshet amar af b'Shabbat nami lo ho'il. Rav Sheshet says, I don't think this works for Shabbat either. He would agree with Rav Hamnuna, who would say this doesn't work. Tistayim. So therefore, from this discussion that Rav Chisda had with Rav Hamnuna, the argument between them, we can understand that Rav Chisda must be the one who said that it works in our case. Amar Rav Chisda. Now Rav Chisda adds this other line. If you have the Koran, you can see there's 3 interpretations in the footnote there. He categorizes it he explains it very well in the footnote there. It's explained very nicely. There's 3 interpretations of this upcoming line. I'll explain it according to Rashi. What the reality of this case is unclear. Okay, but we'll go with Rashi and we'll go with the picture that we have in our book, picture 151. Let's say Rashi says the tail itself was the whole karpaf. Let's say the tail itself was a beit sa'atayim, and you want to live at the top of the tail. Now the tail itself, the mound, creates a mechitza. We already said that, remember? Because if it goes up 10 without going in 4 amod, and it's still at the height of 10 at that point, that creates walls. So in this case, you have walls at the bottom. But now you put up a mechitza near the top around your property that's at the top of the mound. So what does Rav Chisda say here? That modeli Rav Sheshet would agree with me in this case. Again, I'm reading the case according to Rashi. There's other people who read it differently. My timer, that if you put a mechitza up at the top, it would work. What's the reason? I explained before that if I want to take this big space and I want to start living there, I might want to build bigger walls. But theoretically, what Rav Chisda is saying is, I get you, Rav Hamnuna. You don't think those walls really count because you could really manage with the smaller walls, right? With the shorter walls. But in the case of the mound, and you're living at the top of the mound, and the mound itself creates walls, those walls are not serving you in the slightest. When you're at the top of that mound, those walls aren't even visible to you. They're not part of what you're using as your mechitzot. So if you were to build mechitzot up top, those would actually work, even according to Rav Sheshet, who disagrees with me, because those mechitzot are functioning walls that didn't exist before for the people living up at the top. And therefore, those walls would work. Moving on. By Rabba bar Rav Chana. This is a little similar to what we saw yesterday about what if you breach the wall and breach, and altogether you view it as it's breached. It's a little bit similar, but not exactly. You had your space, it had a wall. It wasn't for living purposes. Now what happens? You decide you want to live there. You build higher mechitzot, which we already said, according to everyone except Rav Chisda, doesn't work. Now what happened? After you built the second walls that were built specifically, the upper walls were built for the purposes of living, something happened, some sort of earthquake or some sort of, and the original walls sunk into the ground. Okay, I don't know what kind of, some sort of natural phenomenon happened and they started sinking into the ground. And now you're only left with a karpaf with your new mechitzot. So now your new mechitzot were hukaf l'dira. However, right now, they're not, right, when you built them, they didn't work because they were mechitzot al gabe mechitzot. But at this current moment, they're functioning as your only mechitzot, and those are mechitzot that were put with the intention to live in there. So would that help you? Again, we're talking about a space bigger than Beit Sa'atayim, and you want to fix it with a mechitza. So he asked the following question, and let's see what they answer. So first, he didn't exactly say, was his question relating to Shabbat, or was it relating to Nichse Hager? So he says, Lemai, what's your question about? If you want to say Nichse Hager, I have the answer from Yirmiyah Bira. He says, Yirmiyah Bira, that's his name. I think it's Yirmiyah who comes from the place of Yirah. I'm not sure though, I forget. Amal Rav Yehuda. Amar Rav Yehuda. Haiman deshada lifta apila de'ara degel. Va'ata Yisrael achrina rafik ba'porta. Okay, before I go on, let me start explaining. Somebody throws, we have property that belongs to a ger, the ger died, no inheritors. He throws a turnip and it falls into a hole in the property, even if he threw it with the intent to plant it. Okay, I don't even know if he has to throw it, but even if he puts it in the ground. Okay, but I guess the idea is he puts it in the ground without doing anything more than just putting it in the ground. And then someone else came along and started plowing the ground a little, right? Mixing up the soil. So who is koneh? Batra kane, kama lo kane. The second person acquires it, not the first. Why? My taima. Be'ina deshada lo kashavach. When you threw it, this is very interesting. You have to acquire the land by doing something to make the land better. Now, the only way you can make the land better is if you make it better immediately. By me planting a turnip in the land in the property, that won't help it immediately. Nothing's going to happen immediately. It's going to happen over time. So therefore, what happens? I threw it in. I didn't really do anything at that moment. However, over time, what happened? Over time it will grow, but that is irrelevant to us. The next person who came, moved the soil a little, that person gains the property, even though I theoretically maybe even did more. But they actually did what we call mashbiach et hakarka. He improved the land directly, right? I was a little indirect, or over time it was going to happen. Therefore, it doesn't work. I'm going to see an interesting story about this coming up. So, ki kashavcha mimela kamashavcha. When it happens, when it gets improved, it happened not because of anything I did by throwing the turnip in. It was the other person who ended up then acquiring the property. So what is your question about that? If it was about nichsei ager, clearly this doesn't work. V'linyan Shabbat, havi mechitza nasa b'Shabbat. If it's linyan Shabbat, well, then we have another obvious answer. What's that? It's a mechitza that was created on Shabbat, because what happened? On Shabbat, the walls caved in, right? The bottom mechitza caved in, and now you're left with the upper ones that are way back when you had surrounded for the purposes of living, and now you're actually using them. So now what do we say? So they say, Vitanya, and as we learned, Kol mechitza nasa b'Shabbat, bein b'shogeg, bein b'bezid, shma mechitza. Any mechitza that's created on Shabbat, whether I intentionally made it on Shabbat or didn't. You remember? We said that's a mechitza. So then they say, and therefore this would obviously work as a mechitza. But then they say, wait a minute, but lav itmar ala amar of Nachman lo shanu ela lizrok aval letaltel asur. But wait a minute, didn't we learn already that that's only to call it a private domain, that if you throw from the public domain, you're going to be obligated? But it doesn't allow carrying, and our whole issue is, do you allow to carry? And therefore, the chitza that happened on its own isn't necessarily going to work to allow you to carry. So the answer, no, ki itmar de Rav Nachman amazid itmar, the same way we answered this last time, which is that it's only b'mezid, right? That if you intentionally did it, we penalize you. That we're not going to allow that mechitza to be called a mechitza. But here, no one did it intentionally, in which case this would work. So when it comes to nichsei ager, this totally doesn't work. When it comes to Shabbat, this would work. Okay, that's his answer. So now they give a story. This is I like these kind of stories, even though they're a little bit bothersome, but they're the genre of stories of nashim tzoakot, women who scream. Okay, women who feel like they are getting taken advantage of by the halachic system, and they get very angry. Some of them are different. Some of them are, right, you'll see that her anger is, I would say, justified in a particular way, but not actually against the halacha. Like the halacha didn't really do anything to wrong her. It was more that she didn't know enough to know how to do it properly. So ahi itita, there was a woman to avda mechitza al gabe mechitza b'nichsei hager. She built a mechitza on top of it. There was a ger that died. She came to the property. She said, I'm going to acquire this land. She puts up a wall on top of a pre-existing wall, which we already learned doesn't work. Then, now think about it. She put in a lot of effort to build a wall. It's not so easy to build a wall. Atahu gavra, a guy comes along, rafik ba'porta, he moves the dirt a little bit, okay? He moves the dirt around a little bit, and onto the kamed Rav Nachman, they start getting into a fight about whose land it is. Ukma biyad, so they go in front of Rav Nachman, and ukma biyadeh. Rav Nachman says it belongs to the guy. It doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the man who came, and, I know you built a whole mechitza, and he did nothing really, but the little that he did actually counts. So what's her reaction? Atat ihi, she comes along, she starts screaming at him. How can you do this to me? I put it in the mechitza. This is my property. I came first. I put it up a mechitza. Amar la, he says to her, listen, ma'yavid, what can I, ma'yavid lach? Sorry, there's nothing I can do. My hands are tied. You didn't do it the proper way, so there's nothing I could do to help you. This is a great reason why women should be learning, because if she knew the halacha, she never would have gotten herself into this situation, right? And it's almost like the Gemara is telling us that you need to be knowledgeable. You need to understand, if you're going to try to do things like this, you need to know how to do them. I was even thinking inashe is men, right? Like you don't know how to do it the way the men know how to do it. Like you haven't learned properly. You don't know how to do things properly. I don't think it means, it just means the way people are supposed to do it. But anyway, it's interesting. So it's basically saying, right, and why do the women always scream? I always say this when we get to these screaming stories. They scream because they feel like they have no other way to express themselves, right? They feel they're in this situation, and you feel for these women. They don't know enough, and they're so frustrated because here she tried, and she put in effort, she put in money, and she built a mechitza, and yet she's stuck. Like she just didn't know how to do it right, and she's totally stuck. So she feels really helpless, and when you're helpless, you often start to scream. Okay, moving on. Karpaf beit shalosh. If you have a karpaf that's 3 beit se'ah, so this is obviously way too big, and and it's not hukaf l'dira. So you have this space that's more than 3. Now what happens? If kirabo beit se'ah, let's say you put up, this is 152, you put up a space that has a roof, okay, just a roof, no walls, just you put up a ceiling over 1 beit se'ah. Does this split the property into 2? And now you have 2 beit se'ah in one and 1 beit se'ah in the other. And in which case you're totally fine, because even if it's not ukaf l'dira, it's fine. You're within the right measurements. So Rava Amar avir kiruyo miyatro. So there's actually a debate about whether it's miyatro or mitiro, and it becomes the reverse if you flip it. Rava says that the airspace of the where the ceiling is miyatro. Miyater means to be an addition. It's an addition to the 2 beit se'ah next to it, meaning it's all viewed as 1, which means it's a problem. Some people read it as mitiro, which means it permits it. We view it as 2. So you're going to end up, one says one and one says the other. It's just a matter of who says what. Rabbi Zera Amar ein avir kiruyo miyatro. Now these are viewed as 2 separate spaces. It doesn't view it as if it's an addition. They're 2 separate spaces. So now they suggest, why don't we suggest that their machloket is based on a machloket of Rav and Shmuel? If you have, okay, here's not talking about a beit se'ah and a karpaf. Here you just have in the middle of a bik'ah, which is a big carmelit, which you can't carry in. But you build a little portico. You have like a pergola or something. It's basically a ceiling with 4 little poles. Okay, like a chuppah formation, where there's no walls at all. So this now works based on what we call pi tikra yored v'sotem. That means we view the walls. We talked about this before. When you have a ceiling, a space that's got a full ceiling, we view the ceiling as if it comes down on the sides, and you create walls, and then you can carry in the space. But we're going to see that Rav and Shmuel debate whether, okay, now it's a little tricky, because everybody agrees that pi tikra yored v'sotem, but Shmuel's going to say this doesn't work, and we'll talk about it in 1 minute. So Rav Amar mutar l'taltel b'kula. Rav says you can carry in this whole space because pitikra yored b'sotem. Shmuel Amar ein metaltalim ela b'dalet amot. You can only carry 4 amot. This is basically viewed as part of the big carmelit. It doesn't change its status at all. So Rav Amar mutar l'taltel b'kula amrinam pitikra yored b'sotem. What this means literally is the lip of the ceiling drops down and seals it off. That's what the 4 words mean. Pi, tikra is the ceiling, yored drops down, and sotem, and it seals it off as if it has walls. Ushmuel amar ein metaltalin ela ba'arba amot, lo amrina pi tikra yored b'sotem. You can't say this. Now, why can't you say it? Isn't it a halacha l'Moshe Sinai? It's passed down for generations that this is what it is. Well, he holds it only works if you have 1 wall. You need at least 1 wall, and then we can view the other walls as coming down. He doesn't disagree with the principle. He just disagrees about where it applies. So now, why don't we say the same thing? If you have this walled area in the big karpaf, if we say pitikra yored v'sotem, then it separates it. And then it would be like Rav. And if you say it doesn't separate it, then you would say like Shmuel, that the ceiling doesn't drop down. So now they say, not necessarily. And now they're going to say, you didn't really understand the case properly. And if you looked at the picture, it's a flat, right? It's a flat covering. If you did it like an achsadra, hachinami, then we would say you're right. It would be this machloket. But the case they're arguing about is not there. Everyone agrees with Rav that it would work. The argument is about, it's kind of like a roofed space, the way the roof goes down on both sides, right? It's high in the middle and goes down on both sides. It's angled. This is picture 154. So the case they were discussing was where the roof was angled, and that's why they had a debate. And the ceiling was angled. They said, is this considered, do you say pitikra yoreva sotem in an angled ceiling or not? Okay? And therefore, it's not the same machloket as Rav and Shmuel, because they would all agree with Rav if it was flat. Amar Rabbi Zera. Umodina, now Rabbi Zera, who let's just assume, according to our version, he was the one who said, Ein avir kirio miyatro. We can view this as two separate spaces. So now he says, but I am modeh. I admit that it would be a problem in a different case. Bekarpaf shenifratz bimlo'o lechatzer. Do you remember our case with the small courtyard that opened up into a bigger courtyard? Remember there was a wall between them and then the wall broke? And then the whole issue was you can't carry in the small because you can't see any walls, but in the larger one, because there's walls on the side, there's gipufim, we called them, the little parts of the walls that are still existing on the side because the bigger one was wider than the narrower one, than the small one, it worked. So we remember this image in your head, and you can see the picture here. It looks exactly like that picture, okay, except the shapes are a little different. But you have a karpaf that's a beit satayim. Notice, by the way, in all the pictures, the karpaf is always rectangular, even though we've discussed that a karpaf is often, square. But the karpaf is rectangular, it's long, and it juts out into this chatzer. Now, what happened? There was a wall between them, but the wall broke, and now it's open into the chatzer. So he says, I would agree in that case that if it totally opens into the chatzer, she'asur, that it's now forbidden. Now, remember, the karpaf, before the wall broke, it was a beit satayim, and therefore it was allowed. Now the wall broke, and we're now going to say, just like with the ceiling, right? He said, we're going to view this as if ein avir miyatro. We're going to view this as two separate spaces. But in this case, he says the whole thing is viewed as one space, and it's now bigger than a beit satayim because it's totally open to the chatzer, and that's going to be a problem. My taima ho il va'avir chatzer miyatro says because the chatzer space gets attached to the karpaf space, and it now makes the karpaf bigger than a beit satayim. We're going to have a little bit of trouble with this, though. Matkefla Rav Yosef, b'chi avir hamutarlo osro. Wait a minute. Remember Rabbi Shimon? Rabbi Shimon said you could carry from a karpaf to a chatzer. You can carry from a karpaf to a chatzer, and now a wall is breached between the karpaf and the chatzer. We're now going to say that the chatzer that was permitted for him to carry beforehand now is going to forbid him from carrying in the karpaf. It seems very strange. So Amar le Abaye. Abaye says, Kiman, who are you going according to? Rabbi Shimon, right? You're obviously holding like Rabbi Shimon, because if it wasn't Rabbi Shimon, remember, karpaf can't carry to a chatzer according to the rabbis, in which case it would be totally okay. That would be a classic case of nifratz bimlo'o. Remember, I'll keep repeating this. Le makom she'asur letaltel bo. If it was karpaf chatzer and you couldn't carry in the chatzer to the karpaf, and now one opens up into the other, that would obviously forbid the whole space for a different reason, because it opens into something that's forbidden to it. But he says, if you hold like Rabbi Shimon, which he's obviously holding like, when Rabbi Yosef asks this question, he says it's allowed to carry from one to the other. So it shouldn't, how can a place, a minute ago, these were each permitted to carry from one to the other, and because the wall broke, now you can't carry? It doesn't make any sense. So Abai says, wait, you're holding like Rabbi Shimon. Well, if so, Rabbi Shimon nami ha'ika avir makom mechitzot. The issue here is not the chatzer itself. What's the issue? And if you look in picture, I'm skipping a picture because they don't really show it except for in picture 157. If you look here, there's these yellow dotted lines in between. The thickness, we're talking about that the karpaf was exactly a beit se'ah. What happened? When the wall broke, now you have the space where the wall was, assuming there was thickness to the walls. You now take that little bit of space, it gets added into the karpaf. It's not the chatzer, he says. It's the space in between where the wall existed before and now doesn't exist. That's what messes up the karpaf. So that's why he says, I don't know why you're asking a question, Rav Yosef, that's the issue. And now he quotes to support his answer to Amar Rav Chisda, as Rav Chisda says, "Karpaf shenifratz bimlo'o lechatzer Chatzer muteret b'karpaf asur. Okay, this is back to page 155. That if you have a karpaf that opens into a chatzer, the chatzer is allowed. It's the karpaf that's forbidden. That makes sense now, right? Because why? Chatzer might, so now we have to explain, why is the chatzer permitted and the karpaf is not? Chatzer might taima, if you want to say, now here he's going to suggest something and reject it. If you want to say the chatzer is allowed based on what I told you before, remember the chatzer gdola had these gifufim. If you want to say the chatzer is allowed, okay, right, that's in the picture of 155. You see, the chatzer is the green part. It has those little walls that are facing the karpaf that are still in existence. So they're still standing. So you end up, you really have walls on all four sides. If that's the reason, you can't say that because look at picture 156. Who says it happened this way? It could have happened where the karpaf was wider than the courtyard, in which case the karpaf has gipufim. So that can't be a reason because it could end up the reverse, in which case it always says the karpaf is forbidden, the chatzer is mutar. It can't be the gipufim or what's helping you here. Ela mishum de amrina, and it must be because we say ze avir mechitzot miyatro v'ze ein avir mechitzot miyatro. It must be that we say, where does the avir mechitzot go? The space where the mechitzot were, it must go into the karpaf and not the chatzer. In the chatzer, it doesn't matter if you make the space bigger because there's no limit to the size of a chatzer. A chatzer is always allowed if it has walls. The karpaf, even though it has walls, is going to be a problem based on the size. And that's why I said it must be, the karpaf is always forbidden, the chatzer is mutar, because it must be we're adding the space of the walls into the karpaf, and that's his proof from Rav Chisda to what we said before. Okay, last case for today. Hahu bustana. We're now moving on to picture 158. You have an orchard, lots of trees. On the other side of the orchard, they have a samich leguda da apanda. It's right next to the wall of a palace. Okay, it doesn't have to be a palace necessarily, but a wall of something. Nafal ashita boreata da apanda. The outer wall of, okay, now there was a wall of the palace that was serving as a mechitza for this space. The mechitza now falls, meaning the wall broke to the palace. It wasn't a well-built palace, I guess. The wall breaks. Savar Rabbi Lemema lismoch aguda gviata. Rabbi wanted to say, remember, Savar always means we're going to reject it. He wanted to say, look, inside the house, there's inner walls, right? There's a room here with a table, and there's a back wall there. Let's use that wall as the wall of the orchard. And then we can say it's still okay because it's surrounded by a wall. Amarle Rav Papa, here comes the insult. Mishum de ate mimulai amritu mila moliata, because you come from a family with a broken lineage, you're going to say broken things. Okay, basically, what does this mean? You come from the family of Eli. They were all people whose lives got cut off, meaning they died young. Eli Kohen from the time of Shmuel, sons died young, right? And there's this tradition that all the generations for the future died young, saying because you come from that family, you're not right because your lives get cut off early. Also, kind of, it seems your statements get cut off early, and you say things that are not right. Hanach mechitzot legavai avidan, lebarai lo avidan. Those are inner walls of a house. You can't use an inner wall of a house to count as an outer wall. Now, that doesn't work. So you can't say that that's going to save this orchard and allow carrying within the orchard. Okay, we'll end here for today because we're going to start a new case, which is already going into the next page, and there's a lot of complicated ways to understand it. So I'd rather get started with that tomorrow. So we'll finish for here. Have a good day, everybody.